Is Iran now under attack by ISIL? It claims responsibility for its first gun and suicide assault in the heart of Tehran. Iran's Revolutionary Guard blames Saudi Arabia and the United States. Whoever's to blame, it ramps up the tension in a region already on edge. This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. Welcome to Inside Story. Iran is vowing revenge following two attacks in Tehran on Wednesday. ISIL says it's responsible and is promising more Iranian attacks. Iran's intelligence agency said the attackers were Iranian citizens committed to acts of terror. The Iranian foreign minister says Donald Trump's reaction to the attacks is repugnant. The US president said states which sponsor terrorism risk falling victim to the evil they promote. Rob Matheson has more.
ISIL says it's carried out an attack inside Iran for the first time. The armed group says it's behind the shootings at Iran's parliament in Tehran and a suicide bombing in the south of the city at the tomb of the leader of the Iranian Revolution.
These firecrackers that happened today will not have the slightest effect on the will of the people. If Iran had not confronted terrorists in other countries, they would have faced more attacks in Iran.
ISIL has posted a video online. It says the pictures are from inside the Iranian parliament and show a man being shot. More than a dozen people have been killed. US President Donald Trump offers prayers for the victims, but says the responsibility lies with Iran. In a statement, he says, states that sponsor terrorism risk falling victim to the evil they promote. Iran's Revolutionary Guard says Saudi Arabia is to blame.
In order to know who is behind the attacks, we need to go back and revisit who attacked Iran in the past. Some Saudi officials threatened to take the war inside Iran, just like Trump did.
In May, Hassan Rouhani won a second four-year presidential term after campaigns which focused on improving the economy. Now the government has to deal with a new threat from within Iran itself. Rob Matheson, Al Jazeera.
For more on this, I'm joined by our guests in Tehran, Hassan Ahmadian, Professor of Middle East Studies at the University of Tehran. In London, Andreas Krieg, Assistant Professor at the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. Andreas is a specialist on Gulf security and armed groups. And joining us in Virginia via Skype, Trita Parsi, Professor at Georgetown University and author of Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran and the Triumph of Diplomacy. Very good to have all three of you with us. Hassan Ahmadian, firstly, it must be devastating experiencing such an attack in the capital. How do you feel about what went down and how much has this possibly shaken people living there?
Well, good evening. As you said, it's a shock, and it's gradually being absorbed, I think, by the people, by the public, and by the officials. And people are looking to the future and what should be done about this threat. Up until now, we didn't have any ISIS attack. The security apparatus here claim that they have stopped many attempts to strike Iran. But this actually was the case that ISIS was able to reach Iran's capital and hit the parliament, and two actually places, very symbolic places in Tehran.
And I should imagine exacerbating
anger and
this...
sadness are the main...
anger and sadness, I should imagine exacerbating this anger and sadness is the fact that these are Iranians. It's homegrown terrorism, and the fact that you're being attacked on your own soil by your own.
Actually, they were, they were recruits of ISIS. They got out of the country during ISIS campaign in Syria and Iraq, and then they came to Iran back in 2016. their leader was killed in Iran, and then they fled the country, but the security lost track of them when they came back to Iran and did this, committed this, crimes yesterday. So it's not a homegrown exactly. It's something ideologically motivated by outside of Iran, and then recruited by outsiders, and then sent back to Iran to strike Iran. That's the linkage between Iran's national security and its regional policy that the government, I think, has been trying to prove to the internal and the external, observers.
Trita Parsi, this is a big development, isn't it? A disturbing, very worrying development for Iran.
Certainly, it's tremendously worrisome, and particularly mindful of the fact that not only did the ISIS recruits manage to get back into the country, and the Iranian security forces have been quite effective thus far in fending off many attempts by ISIS and Al-Qaeda to strike the country. But once they finally succeeded, they didn't just strike in the border areas, they actually struck in Tehran at the very heart of the capital, inside the parliament even. So that is definitely shaking up Iran's security apparatus, I would assume. But even more worrisome is that if this does have a regional dimension, in the sense that this in any way, shape or form was sponsored by an outside actor, particularly now mindful of the tremendous tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, this could be the beginning of something much bigger and much more worrisome and destabilizing in the region as a whole.
Andreas Krieg, how are you viewing what happened and the fact that they were able to avoid the security services? Is this a security failure, or is there something else going on here?
Well, I think it is not a security failure, because for a long period of time Iran was able to secure its borders and was able to secure its people inside of Iran. The strategy, the counterterrorism strategy of Iran has been one for many years that is one of delegation and externalization there. So that we call it a campfire strategy, whereby you try to keep the terrorist threat away from home by fighting terrorism overseas. So that kind of explains the campaigns in Syria and Iraq, where Iran has been very much invested into a counterinsurgency and counterterrorism struggle, mostly against jihadist groups as well as terrorist groups. But you have to also see this within the wider dimension of the Iranian or Persian Arab conflict, the rift between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the allegations are obviously coming now from the hardliners in Iran, saying that this is something that the Saudis have fueled. This is based in the Wahhabist ideology, and obviously certain remarks by the Crown Prince, or by Mohammed bin Salman over the last months, seem to suggest that, at least to some hardliners in Iran, that possibly Saudi Arabia might be behind this. And obviously Saudi Arabia denies this and is claiming that instead Iran is behind all the terrorism that we see in the region.
Hassan, is that the feeling now, that actually, whoever recruited them, at the end of the day, this is because of the relationship with Saudi Arabia, or lack of a relationship?
Yeah, well, the indications that we've had from Saudi Arabia during the past month, actually, in 2nd of May, the Deputy Crown Prince spoke about taking the fight inside Iran. And then Adel Jubeir, just a couple of hours before the ISIS stroke, he tweeted about Iran's sponsorship of terrorism and his, very well-known claims against Iran. So a part of it, yeah, it is the escalation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the rift between the two has created the space, at least, for these sort of operations within Iran and elsewhere in the region. I think this is a part of the equation, and Saudi Arabia has spoken, and its officials actually has spoken very quite clearly about hitting Iran within its borders. This has been a part of the very much messages that have been circulating around in Iran about the yesterday attacks, that Saudis are behind it. And the IRGC has claimed that Saudi Arabia was behind it, and even Foreign Minister Zarif also indicated, not so directly, that the Saudis have supported such a thing, and I think this will lead to even more escalation between the two.
And Trita, yet Donald Trump believes that those behind terrorism, the biggest players, are Iran and Qatar.
Yes, quite shocking, isn't it? I think the statement President Trump came out with yesterday, and I think it's important to note, this was not an improvised tweet that he has in one of these moments when he can't control himself. This was a well-prepared, highly edited statement coming out of his national security staff. And it made it quite clear that this administration and the people in the national security apparatus right now cannot even express solidarity and empathy with victims of terrorism if they are in Iran without at the same time politicizing it and at the same time throw out as much violence as possible. And I think it shows this addiction to enmity that several of these individuals in the White House have when it comes to the relationship with Iran.
Okay, we heard that statement in Rob's package, but let's look at it again, at the White House reaction to the attack. This is how it goes. We grieve and pray for the innocent victims of the terrorist attacks in Iran and for the Iranian people who are going through such challenging times. We underscore that states that sponsor terrorism risk falling victim to the evil they promote. Andreas, what is the message there? I mean, we saw something similar in London when Donald Trump attacked the mayor. Excuse me. I mean, is it a case of kicking a country when they're down? Is it a case of being slightly patronizing and see if you behave badly, this kind of thing will happen to you? I mean, what is it?
I mean, yeah, in London it was slightly different. I think it was probably Donald Trump didn't really understand what was going on, and he kind of took it out of the context. It was one of these uncontrollable moments. When it comes to Iran, it was definitely, I agree, that was not an uncontrollable moment. That was very deliberately saying, you know, this is part of the United States, of the new administration's foreign policy in the Middle East, by clearly making out Iran as the absolute evil that has to be fought. And that's why, you know, the alignment between the United States and the GCC countries at the moment, that's at least what Trump was trying to do, trying to build an alliance against Iran. So Trump sees Iran as the absolute most important state sponsor of terrorism in the region. He's supported there with conservative circles in the Republican Party, as well as conservative circles within Israel, who all seem to suggest that Iran is the absolute evil, and then thereby obviously missing the point that a lot of the evil, particularly if you look at Salafi jihadist terrorism, that is ISIS, that's Al-Qaeda, and many of the other jihadist groups, they're actually originating in Sunni extremism, in Wahhabi Salafi ideology. They don't originate in Iranian or in Iranian
Andrew, so does this then challenge Riyadh's allegation that Tehran is behind all acts of terrorism in the region, the fact that this happened on their home soil?
So the issue is that what people fail to see here in America, especially in the UAE and Saudi Arabia as well, is that terrorism is something that that can be defined by the eye of the beholder. And they don't understand yet that terrorism has very many different aspects to it. So we see, for example, when we see terrorists, there's terrorist ideology, there's terrorism against individuals, such as we see in the Salafi jihadist groups, and then we have other groups who use terrorist activities against mostly military targets, and that's how the Shia militias are using them, or how Hezbollah has been using them, particularly against military targets in Iraq or in Syria, or against military targets in Israel. And that's slightly different from the kind of Salafi jihadist extremism that we've seen being sponsored by Saudi Arabia or being supported by the Wahhabist ideology that comes out of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf.
That tweet that you were talking about, the Iranians have criticized it, including a US senator from Connecticut, about this tweet, and he criticized the White House. Chris Murphy said, by the way, an inexplicable anti-Qatar rants and bizarre Iran sympathy insult statement, Trump Middle East policy coming fully off the rails this week. Hassan, what is your response to those comments by Chris Murphy that the Middle East policy under Donald Trump is coming off the rails?
Well, the debates that has been here is that Donald Trump is misleading his Middle East partners with the rhetoric that he's conveying to them against Iran. It's a Twitter rhetoric that might not lead to actions, but it will lead his partners and allies to commit some sort of, policies in the region. And lots of people has been speaking about the misleading points that he has made in Riyadh and on Twitter that has led Deputy Crown Prince and other officials in Saudi Arabia to speak this harshly against Iran and to try to isolate Qatar as well, which is actually something beyond rationality. The debate here suggests that Saudi Arabia is actually isolating itself by trying to isolate Qatar and Iran and whomever works with them as well. So Trump's Middle East policy is indirectly harming the stability in the region and creating more mess in the already hostility and rivalry-driven region.
Okay, let me put that to treat. I mean, is this Trump's policy playing out? I know that there were many, particularly in Iran, who said the minute Trump came to the region, a relatively peaceful part of the world, everything's gone awry. Do you think that this is yet another shockwave of that visit?
I do believe that what Trump is doing right now is helping destabilize the region. I think it's important to note, for instance, when he's pointing to Iran as the sole source of evil or terrorism in the world, according to the Global Terrorism Database, 94% of all victims of terrorism since 2001 have been at the hands of Wahhabi or other forms of Sunni terrorists, not by the type of things that Iran has been involved in, particularly in the 1980s and 90s. And this rhetoric from the US side is very reminiscent from the approach that the Clinton administration took in the mid-1990s, in which it also was pointing to Iran as the real source of instability in the region. And the reason for that was because at that time, the Clinton administration was trying to create a new order in the region under the doctrine of dual containment, which was based on the centrality of Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. It succeeded with that, and its main opponent was Iran. And in order to be able to isolate Iran, everything that was wrong with the region was Iran's fault. Now, the Trump administration is using that rhetoric again precisely for the very same reason. He has bought into the idea that the Israelis and the Saudis have been arguing for more than 10 years now, that the United States needs to revert back to that posture. Incidentally, the American-led order was destroyed by the United States itself by going into Iraq and failing so miserably. And the Saudis and the Israelis have been arguing for quite some time that the US needs to restore that order, isolate Iran, and essentially provide a security umbrella for its key allies that are under Pax Americana. As long as the United States is seeking a position of hard hegemony in the region, Iran will be its main opponent because the Iranians oppose external hegemony in the region, and the United States will blame everything that goes wrong on the Iranians, whether it's true or not.
Andreas, where does this leave Iran now? We know that in the GCC, fallout Bahrain has asked Qatar to step away from Iran. Obviously, we're not sure how that's going to play out. But militarily and politically, what can Iran do now? Because they work very closely with the US on the battlefield to fight ISIL.
Very good point. I mean, Iran, we have to understand one thing about the GCC, and this is something that I've raised many times, is that when GCC countries fail to keep their own house in order and other Arab countries keep their house in order, the Iranians have always looked for ways to come in and help those communities that are disenfranchised and that feel alienated. And that happened in Bahrain, that happened in Saudi Arabia, that happened in Yemen, that happened in Iraq. So when minorities, not only Shia minorities, but particular Shia minorities have been alienated and sidelined in Sunni majority Arab countries, the Iranians have found always a very fertile ground for intervention, very clandestine intervention, and to various degrees. So what Iran's options are at the moment, obviously I would say that for the Iranians, a cooperation, even indirect cooperation in Iraq with the United States Air Force in terms of fighting ISIS was mutually beneficial. And I think they thought that under the Obama administration they could find somewhat a common ground militarily to fight ISIS, to fight extremism. Now we are at a point where there's a clear-cut, black and white. Iran is on the other side is at least by Trump and his administration being put on the other side of that continuum. And now Iran has to look for alternative ways to achieve its own objectives. And I think, for example, the visit to Turkey is quite a strategic one. Turkey has been somewhat sidelined as well by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This triangle that we used to have between Ankara, Doha, and Riyadh is now being basically broken apart by Saudi Arabia, and Turkey and Qatar are now somewhat isolated, and they look for alternative means to cooperate, and the Iranians will be there and offering whatever they can offer. Obviously, we shouldn't overestimate what Iran can do, because its military works not conventionally but unconventionally. But nonetheless, when it comes to Syria, a cooperation between Turkey and Iran to a certain degree might undermine US policy and might undermine as well Saudi and UAE policy. So I think what they're driving at here at the moment, the Trump administration, and then as well with their proxies of Saudi and the UAE, is somewhat counterproductive to what they actually want to achieve, because what they need is unity, not disunity. And by pushing others out of this unity into the hands of Iran, as they have done many times before with other minorities in the region, is actually very counterproductive to their foreign policy strategy.
Okay. Hassan, will this benefit Iran, the fallout within the GCC? Will they be able to use this to their own end? And I'm just wondering about those comments made by Andreas about Turkey. Will they be looking for a closer relationship with Turkey now and bringing them closer as well to Russia?
Well, there haven't been any, Iranians didn't try to use it. I would refrain from using the term using, but considering the fact that Saudis has been trying time and again to isolate Iran and to impose more assertive policy against Iran regional and create a regional front against Iran, this shift is strategically is not working on their favor. And I think the Qataris are now more going for more independent policy in the region, take into account that Qataris and Turks in the region have had different agendas back in the Brotherhood. Saudi Arabia and the UAE were opposing the Brotherhood in the region, and at the same time opposing Iran. Now, King Salman once came to the power, he prioritized Iran, bringing Qatar and Turkey on board, or trying at least to bring them on board. Now, this rift is, splitting this, creating this split within the anti-Iran front, and I think that
Hassan
in
Ahmadian,
itself, without Iran even trying to use it, is something in its favor.
Hassan Ahmadian, thank you very much. Thank you to Andreas Krieg and to you, Trita Parsi. And thank you as well for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page, and you can find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. And from me, Jane Dutton, the rest of the team, thank you for watching.